and my mother was a Dutch immigrant. And both my parents were defended and liberated by Canadian soldiers during the Second World War. My family owes everything.
Well, the voice you're hearing and the person you're looking at now is federal Conservative leadership candidate Michael Chong, as he talks about his Canadian roots. Now, the longtime Ontario MP is campaigning hard in these final days of the leadership race. The Conservative Party will elect a new leader on May the 27th. Well, ahead of that, Michael Chong joins us now live in studio as we continue our weekend series of interviews with Conservative leadership hopefuls. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you know, this is a broad conversation, so I'm going to begin with the very basic here. When we talk about Conservatives, we know there are social Conservatives, there are fiscal Conservatives, there are progressive Conservatives. How do you define your conservatism?
Well, I believe in a big tent conservatism. And what that means is that I believe in a Conservative Party that includes all kinds of Conservatives: social Conservatives, Libertarians, Democratic Reformers, Progressive Conservatives, and fiscal Conservatives. And I think the way forward is to focus on things that unite all these different kinds of Conservatives. And for me, that begins with presenting a fiscally conservative option in the next election.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about a wide tent conservatism, but one of your more famous policy stands has to do with carbon taxes. That is rubbing a lot of Conservatives the wrong way. In fact, as you talk about a carbon tax, you are, forgive me, often booed by the membership that has been listening to these debates. Do you have what it takes? Does your conservatism have what it takes to attract all those different strands of Conservatives under one banner?
Well, Michael, I believe as a Conservative in standing on principle and on standing on Conservative principles about a belief in free markets and smaller government. And the most conservative way to reduce emissions is a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And that's why increasingly Conservatives are coming forward to support my approach, which is this revenue-neutral carbon tax. That's why Conservatives like former Policy Director Mark Cameron, Mr. Harper's former head of policy in the PMO, supports this approach, and why Reagan Conservatives like George Shultz and James Baker support this approach.
But those aren't the Conservatives that you need to support you, because if you listen to membership in Alberta, membership in Saskatchewan, they're not happy with the very idea of a carbon tax. Are you out of step with the rank and file that you need to attract to your campaign in order to become a leader? Well,
I think whenever you take strong positions on issues, there are going to be people in favor and people opposed to certain policies. At the end of the day, we're attracting a lot of support to our campaign for these policies. I can tell you that we signed up about a fifth of new party members, many of them younger Conservatives, millennials, who understand the need to reduce emissions, but in a conservative market-based approach. So while the policy has generated a lot of debate, that's what leadership races are really all about. Now's the time to have these debates about the future direction of the party, and not during the third week of a general election campaign.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we say, we've got, about 5 weeks left before Conservatives actually choose their next leader. And the recent polling, and as we talk about issues like carbon tax, if you look at the recent polling that's been done in terms of your likelihood of winning, you're somewhere in the middle of the pack. You're not number one, you're not number two, you're somewhere in the middle of the pack. What do you need to do to convince these Conservatives who may have concerns over what you stand for, including a carbon tax? How do you convince them over the next 5 weeks to support you?
Well, quite simply, this leadership race is a very stark choice. Do we want to win in 2019, or do we want to hand the Liberals' government for a generation? We will not win in the next election unless we have a credible policy to reduce emissions in 2019. If we don't have a credible policy, we will hand the next election to the Liberal Party. I'm the only candidate in this race that's come forward with a credible policy, a conservative policy, based on free markets and smaller government to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
But do you have a path to victory, though? How would you define that path? Who are you going to pull over into the Chong camp in order to become the leader?
Well, we believe we have a path to victory. Our goal is to get about 15 to 20% on the first ballot. We believe we've sold the memberships to do exactly that, and we think we can grow from there. We think that puts us in the top 4 campaigns on the first ballot, and as candidates drop off, we believe we will receive a lot of that second and third ballot support. We think that the supposed frontrunners in this race have limited room for growth. A lot of them have much higher negatives than my campaign.
Well, one person who you have criticized very openly is Kelly Leitch in this leadership race. And she, at this point, is polling better than you are. What does that say to you?
Well, I think it says that we have a stark choice as Conservatives. At the end of the day, many of the other leadership candidates cannot win in 2019. Kelly Leitch has played to anti-immigrant sentiment. This country is built on immigration. 40% of Canadians are foreign-born or born to a foreign-born parent. playing to anti-immigrant sentiment will lead to a loss in 2019. So her path is not the path to victory. With Max Bernier, he's proposing to slash government expenditures by some 30 to 40% in order to pay for his tax cuts. We saw the result of that in the last provincial election when Tim Hudak proposed to eliminate 500,000 public service jobs. It leads to defeat. There again, that's not the path to victory. And Kevin O'Leary is a candidate who doesn't even live in Canada, who spends most of his time in the United States. And we need a leader who is a full-time leader of the Conservative Party. So Conservative Party members need to take a strong, hard look at the various options in front of them. And I think when they do, they'll realize that there's only one candidate in this race that can win in 2019, and that's Michael Chong.
Well, you know, when you do an equation, and to be fair, when Harper was elected with his majority, he proved that you don't need Quebec in order to win a majority government in this country. But you did leave the Harper government on a principled stance. You did not want to acknowledge Quebec as a nation within the United Canada. Are you concerned about attracting Quebec delegates to your leadership? And what about as a leader who would lead a party into an election? Can you win votes in Quebec considering that stand that you took against Quebec nationalism?
Well, it's a great question. I was in Quebec earlier this week in 5 different ridings, Trois-Rivières, Drummondville, in places in that area. And we're getting a lot of support in Quebec for a position on agriculture, for a position on the environment. But that's an old debate that you've raised, the whole issue of the Quebec nation and Quebec's nationhood. I don't plan on reopening that debate if I become party leader. But I think I'd add a very important point, which is that the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had exactly the same position as I did in 2006 on this issue, and it didn't hurt him in the last election. In fact, he won the single biggest number of seats in Quebec since his father, Pierre Trudeau, swept the province in the election of 1980. This is not going to be an issue for us in the next election if I become party leader.
How does that incident, though, inform you as a potential leader of your party? How does that guide MP independence, cabinet independence, if you are actually to become the leader of the party and to become Prime Minister?
Well, I believe that cabinet ministers report to the Prime Minister. That's our cabinet form of government. But individual MPs in a caucus do not report to the party leader, quite the opposite. I believe that party leaders, including the Prime Minister, are accountable to elected members of Parliament. So those are two very different kinds of relationships. In my party, as Conservative Party leader, I will give elected MPs a lot more autonomy, a lot more power to represent their constituents and to stand on principle. I believe we need sweeping democratic reforms to the Senate, to the House of Commons, and to political parties to sweep out political elites who often control the back rooms of our nation's corridors of power and return power to ordinary people and to their elected representatives in Ottawa, members of Parliament.
Okay. You know, I also want to get your opinion on current policy. We saw the Ontario Premier introduce a number of different regulations trying to essentially curtail the growth in real estate values and also bring back rent control and expand it in this province. What do you make of that move by the Ontario Premier to try to rein in housing prices in the Greater Toronto Area?
It's not going to work because it doesn't...
Do you support jumping in and trying to regulate on some form?
I believe we need to address the core problem, which is skyrocketing housing prices, which are putting home affordability out of reach for many middle-class families. But they haven't tackled the fundamental cause for these skyrocketing housing prices, and that cause rests in Ottawa. The fundamental cause is CMHC's mortgage insurance and securitization program that has led to unsustainable rates of residential mortgage credit growth over the last 10 to 15 years, and that in turn is what has led to skyrocketing housing prices. So all the plans that current Finance Minister Bill Morneau and the provincial budget announced recently aren't going to fix this problem because they don't address the root cause, which is CMHC's mortgage insurance program. We're repeating the exact same mistakes the Americans made prior to the 2008 American housing crash. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had implicit guarantees from the U.S. government to churn out these mortgage guarantees, and that's exactly what the banks did. And they inflated credit at an unsustainable pace, and that in turn led to unsustainable housing prices, and we all know where that ended in 2008. We're repeating the same mistake here, and until we address the root cause, which is CMHC's policies that are privatizing bank profits and socializing the risk and putting that risk on the back of taxpayers, we are not going to fix this problem.
Okay, well, quickly losing time here, but I have to ask before you, because quite frankly, this leadership campaign has been odd at times when it comes to your campaign, to be fair. Let's bring up this photo, because your picture showed up in Guatemala in these public bathroom ads in that country. And then there was the Globe and Mail columnist who talked about trying to breastfeed your child. It has taken a weird turn for you. What do you make of all of that?
Well, sometimes I wonder if I've entered a leadership race or a campaign to guarantee sanitary bathrooms in Latin America. But, you know, my parents were immigrants to this country. My father was a Chinese immigrant and my mom was a Dutch immigrant. So I think, obviously, the product of that union produces someone who appeals to Latin Americans. So I'm happy to broaden the campaign in that way.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll leave it there. Michael, thank you so much for the time.
Thanks for having me.